January 14, 1973. Pine Valley, Colorado. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes against the amber glow of the streetlights, each crystal catching the light like scattered diamonds before disappearing into the darkness beyond. The small mountain town of Pine Valley lay nestled in the shadow of the Rockies, its Victorian houses and modest storefronts creating an illusion of safety that would prove devastatingly false before the next sunrise. Margaret Rose Winters pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of Murphy's Diner, the warmth from inside dissipating instantly in the bitter January air. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that turned heads without trying. Auburn hair that caught fire in certain light, green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a smile that could disarm even the most guarded hearts. Tonight, however, that smile was nowhere to be found. She glanced at her watch. 7:45 p.m. Danny Kowalski was supposed to meet her at 7:30 for dinner, their third date in as many weeks. The waitress, a kind-faced woman named Betty, had refilled Margaret's coffee cup twice while she waited, each refill accompanied by an increasingly sympathetic look. "Still no sign of him, honey?" Betty asked, appearing at Margaret's elbow with a pot of coffee that had long since gone cold. Margaret shook her head, fighting back the familiar sting of disappointment that had become all too common in her dating life since her divorce 2 years prior. Her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, was staying with her grandmother for the weekend, giving Margaret a rare evening to herself. She'd been looking forward to it for days. "Men," Betty muttered under her breath, her tone carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Half of them ain't worth the powder to blow 'em up." Despite her disappointment, Margaret managed a weak smile. "It's all right, Betty. Maybe something came up at work." Even as she said it, she didn't believe it. Danny worked at the sawmill, and they'd been shut down since Thursday due to equipment failure. As she stood on the sidewalk, watching her breath create small clouds in the frigid air, Margaret heard the rumble of an engine approaching. A white 1969 Camaro pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with the confidence of recent restoration. The passenger window rolled down, revealing two familiar faces. "Maggie," called out Tommy Brennan from the driver's seat, his boyish grin visible even in the dim light. "What are you doing standing out here in the cold?" Tommy was 24, 4 years younger than Margaret, with the kind of restless energy that seemed to vibrate through everything he touched. He worked odd jobs around town, construction, landscaping, whatever paid cash, and had been trying to ask Margaret out for months. She'd always politely declined, sensing something unpredictable beneath his charming exterior. In the passenger seat sat Eddie Flores, Tommy's constant companion and polar opposite. Where Tommy was lean and wiry with sandy brown hair, Eddie was stocky and dark, with careful eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. At 25, he possessed a quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable, though he'd never been anything but polite to Margaret during their brief encounters around town. "Danny stood me up," Margaret said, immediately regretting the admission. She didn't want to seem pathetic, especially not to Tommy, whose interest in her was already more persistent than she preferred. Tommy's expression shifted to one of theatrical outrage. "That son of a—" He caught himself, glancing at Margaret with an apologetic smile. "Sorry, that's just wrong, Maggie. A beautiful woman like you shouldn't be standing alone in the cold." "It happens," Margaret said, taking a step back from the car. Something about the way both men were looking at her made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite articulate why. "Come on," Tommy said, leaning across Eddie to get closer to the window. "Let us give you a ride home. It's freezing out here, and your car's still in the shop, right?" Margaret hesitated. Her Volkswagen Bug had been at Peterson's garage for 3 days, waiting for parts. The walk home was only 12 blocks, but the snow was getting heavier, and the temperature was dropping fast. The weather report had called for a major storm system moving in overnight. "I don't want to impose," she said. "No imposition at all," Eddie spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. "Tommy's right. It's too cold for walking." Against her better judgment, Margaret found herself nodding. "Just to my house, then. Thank you." She climbed into the back seat, immediately noting the smell of beer and cigarettes that clung to the car's interior. A half-empty bottle of Coors sat in the cup holder between the front seats, and she could see more empties scattered on the floor. "You boys been having a good evening?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light despite the growing unease in her stomach. "Just driving around," Tommy said, pulling away from the curb with unnecessary force. "You know how it is on Sunday nights in this town, nothing to do but cruise and drink." They drove in relative silence for several minutes, the radio playing low in the background. Margaret recognized the song American Pie by Don McLean, its haunting melody seeming oddly appropriate for the moment. She watched the familiar streets of Pine Valley slide past the windows, noting how different everything looked through the falling snow. When Tommy passed her street without slowing down, Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. "Tommy," she said, leaning forward. "That was Elm Street. My house is back there." "I know," Tommy replied, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. "But the night's still young, Maggie. We thought maybe you'd like to see something cool." "I really should get home," Margaret said, her voice taking on an edge of firmness. "Emma's expecting me to call her at my mother's house." "5 minutes," Eddie said, turning in his seat to face her. "There's this place up on Devil's Ridge we want to show you. The view of the valley at night is incredible." Devil's Ridge was a notorious spot among the local teenagers, a narrow dirt road that wound up the mountainside to a cliff overlooking the valley. It was also isolated, accessible only by the single winding road, with no houses or businesses for miles in any direction. "I'd rather not," Margaret said, her voice now betraying her growing anxiety. "Please, just take me home." Tommy's eyes found hers in the mirror again, and this time she saw something different in them. Something harder, more predatory. "Come on, Maggie. Don't be such a party pooper. We're just being friendly." The car began to climb, leaving the well-lit streets of Pine Valley behind for the dark mountain road that led to Devil's Ridge. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap as she tried to think of a way out of the situation. She could demand that they stop the car and let her out, but they were already miles from town, and the snow was falling harder now. "This isn't funny anymore," she said, her voice tight with fear. "I want to go home, now." Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Relax, Maggie. We're not going to hurt you. We just want to have a little fun." "What kind of fun?" Margaret asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Eddie opened the glove compartment and pulled out a small silver flask. "The kind that requires a little liquid courage," he said, unscrewing the cap and taking a long pull before offering it to Tommy. The car climbed higher, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow like searchlights. Margaret could see the lights of Pine Valley growing smaller in the distance, twinkling like fallen stars against the dark canvas of the valley floor. The isolation was complete now. No other cars, no houses, no signs of civilization, except for the distant glow of the town they'd left behind. "Please," Margaret said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I have a daughter. She needs me." "We know about Emma," Tommy said casually, and Margaret felt ice form in her veins. How did they know her daughter's name? She'd never mentioned it to either of them. "You've been watching me," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Small town," Eddie said with a shrug. "Everyone knows everyone else's business." But Margaret knew it was more than that. She remembered now the strange sensation she'd had over the past few weeks of being watched. Glimpses of a white car in her peripheral vision when she walked to work or picked up groceries. She'd dismissed it as paranoia, the lingering effects of her messy divorce and the stress of being a single mother. The Camaro crested a hill and turned onto a narrow dirt road that Margaret recognized with growing dread. The road to Devil's Ridge was barely wide enough for one car, with a steep drop-off on one side and a wall of rock on the other. In good weather it was treacherous enough. In this snow, it was practically suicidal. "Turn around," Margaret said, her voice now openly pleading. "This road is dangerous in this weather." "We've driven it 100 times, Tommy replied, but she could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. The car slipped slightly on the icy surface, and he had to fight to keep it straight. They drove in tense silence for another 10 minutes, the road growing progressively narrower and more dangerous. Finally, they reached the end, a small clearing overlooking the valley, with a sheer drop of nearly 2,000 feet, just beyond a row of weathered warning signs. Tommy killed the engine, and suddenly the only sounds were the wind howling through the pine trees and the soft whisper of snow against the windshield. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Eddie said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked out at the view, despite herself. Even through her fear, she had to admit it was breathtaking. The lights of Pine Valley sparkled far below like a cluster of jewels, and the snow-covered mountains stretched endlessly in all directions. Under different circumstances, it might have been romantic. "I've seen it," she said. "Now please take me home." Tommy turned in his seat to face her fully. "Not yet, Maggie. We've got all night. What do you want from me?" Margaret asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Just a little company," Tommy said, his hand reaching for the door handle. "Come on, let's get some fresh air." "I'm not getting out of this car," Margaret said firmly. Tommy's expression darkened. "Yes, you are." He opened his door and stepped out into the swirling snow, motioning for Eddie to do the same. Margaret watched in growing terror as both men got out of the car, leaving the doors open to let in the bitter cold. "Come on, Maggie," Tommy called, his voice now carrying a clear threat. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Margaret looked at the keys still dangling from the ignition. If she could somehow get into the driver's seat, she might be able to drive out of there. But Eddie seemed to read her thoughts, because he moved to block her path to the front of the car. "I know what you're thinking," he said, his voice calm and almost gentle. "But you can't drive this road. You'll end up at the bottom of the cliff." "Like you care," Margaret said, surprising herself with her defiance. Eddie's expression didn't change. "Actually, I do care. We don't want to hurt you, Margaret. We just want to spend some time with you. By forcing me to come up here against my will, by giving you a chance to see what you've been missing," Tommy interjected, moving closer to the open door. "You think you're too good for us, don't you? Think we're just a couple of lowlifes not worth your time?" "That's not true," Margaret said, though they all knew it was a lie. She had considered them beneath her, not because of their jobs or their social status, but because of something indefinable that had always made her uncomfortable around them. "Prove it," Tommy said, extending his hand toward her. "Come out here and talk to us. Really talk to us. Give us a chance." Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, then at Eddie standing guard near the front of the car, then at the treacherous road that led back to safety. The snow was falling harder now, and she could barely make out the lights of Pine Valley in the distance. She made her choice. Instead of taking Tommy's hand, Margaret suddenly lunged toward the driver's seat, desperate to reach the keys and lock herself in. But Tommy was faster. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, yanking her back toward the open door. "I don't think so, sweetheart," he said, his voice now openly menacing. Margaret tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Let go of me." "Get out of the car, Margaret," Eddie said, his quiet voice somehow more frightening than Tommy's obvious anger. Now, with no other choice, Margaret allowed herself to be pulled from the back seat. The moment her feet hit the snow-covered ground, she felt the full force of the mountain wind cutting through her coat like razors. The temperature had to be well below zero, and the snow was falling so hard she could barely see 10 feet in any direction. "There," Tommy said, releasing her wrist, but staying close enough to grab her again if she tried to run. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably. "I'm freezing. Please, let me get back in the car." "In a minute," Eddie said. "First, we need to have our talk." "What talk?" Margaret asked, though her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely get the words out. "About respect," Tommy said, moving to stand directly in front of her. about giving people a chance instead of looking down on them. I never looked down on you, Margaret protested. Bullshit, Tommy spat. Every time I tried to talk to you, you acted like I was some kind of disease. Like I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air as the great Margaret Winters. That's not true, Margaret said, but even as she said it, she knew there was some truth to his words. She had avoided him, made excuses when he asked her out, treated him with polite dismissal rather than genuine consideration. It is true, Eddie said quietly. We've both seen it. The way you look at us, the way you hurry past when you see us coming, like we're dangerous animals. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Margaret. They were dangerous and her instincts had been right all along. But saying that now would only make things worse. I'm sorry if I gave that impression, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. It wasn't intentional. Show us, Tommy said, stepping even closer. Show us you're sorry. How? Margaret asked, though she was afraid of the answer. Tommy's smile was cold as the mountain air. Kiss me. What? You heard me. Kiss me. Show me that I'm not beneath you. Margaret stared at him in horror. Tommy, please. I'm freezing. Can we just get back in the car and talk about this on the way home? After, Tommy said. Kiss me first. Margaret looked around desperately, hoping to see headlights on the road or some sign of help, but there was nothing. They were completely alone on the mountain, and the snow was falling so heavily now that even if someone did come looking for her, they'd never make it up the treacherous road. I can't, she whispered. Tommy's expression darkened further. Can't or won't? I won't, Margaret said, finding some reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed. This is wrong, Tommy. You know it's wrong. What's wrong is the way you've been treating us, Tommy said, his voice rising with anger. What's wrong is the way you think you're better than everyone else in this town. That's not true, Margaret protested, but the words were lost in the howling wind. Eddie moved closer, and Margaret found herself trapped between the two men and the open door of the car. The cliff was only 50 yards away, marked by a line of weathered wooden posts that were already becoming obscured by the falling snow. Maybe she needs some encouragement, Eddie said quietly. Margaret saw Tommy's hand move to his jacket pocket, and her heart stopped when she saw the glint of metal. It was a gun, a small caliber revolver that looked almost toy-like in the swirling snow. Tommy, no, she breathed. It's not loaded, Tommy said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I just want you to understand how serious we are. Margaret's mind raced, trying to find some way out of the situation. If she ran, she'd either freeze to death in the wilderness or fall off the cliff in the blinding snow. If she stayed, she was at the mercy of two men who were clearly beyond reason. Please, she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. I have a little girl. She needs her mother. Then you better start cooperating, Tommy said, raising the gun until it was pointed directly at her chest. Margaret closed her eyes, thinking of Emma's sweet face, her infectious laugh, the way she curled up next to her mother during thunderstorms. She thought of all the things she'd never get to see. Emma's first day of high school, her graduation, her wedding day. When she opened her eyes, both men were staring at her with expressions she couldn't read in the swirling snow. The gun was still pointed at her, but Tommy's hand was shaking. Whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't tell. All right, she said quietly. What do you want me to do? Tommy's smile returned, but there was no warmth in it. That's better. Now we're getting somewhere. But as Margaret took a step toward him, the sound of a car engine echoed up from the road below, growing steadily louder. All three of them froze, listening to the approaching vehicle. Shit, Eddie muttered, peering through the snow toward the road. Someone's coming. Tommy lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. Maybe they'll turn around when they see the conditions. But the engine sound continued to grow louder, and within minutes a pair of headlights became visible through the snow, creeping slowly up the treacherous mountain road. Margaret felt a surge of hope. If she could somehow signal for help, Don't even think about it, Tommy said, as if reading her thoughts. You make a sound, and I'll tell whoever it is that we're just having a little party up here. The approaching vehicle, a pickup truck from the sound of it, reached the clearing and stopped about 30 yards away. The engine idled for a moment, then shut off. Margaret could see a figure moving in the cab, but the falling snow made it impossible to identify who it was. A car door slammed, and footsteps crunched through the snow toward them. "Tommy? Eddie? That you boy?" Margaret recognized the voice immediately, and her heart sank. It was Frank Morrison, a local drunk who lived in a trailer at the edge of town. Far from being a rescuer, Frank was more likely to join in whatever Tommy and Eddie had planned. "Hey, Frank," Tommy called out, his voice artificially cheerful. "What brings you up here on a night like this?" Frank emerged from the swirling snow like a ghost, his weathered face visible in the glow from the car's interior light. He was wearing a heavy winter coat that made him look twice his actual size, and Margaret could smell the alcohol on him from 10 feet away. "Saw your car heading up the mountain," Frank said, his words slightly slurred. "Figured you boys might want some company." His eyes found Margaret, and his expression changed to one of surprise and something else, something that made her skin crawl. "Well, well," Frank said, moving closer. "If it isn't the beautiful Margaret Winters, what's a classy lady like you doing up here with these two troublemakers?" "Just showing her the view," Tommy said quickly. Frank's laugh was harsh and knowing. "The view, right?" He looked Margaret up and down in a way that made her feel violated. "Must be some view to bring a respectable woman like you up here on a night like this." "It's not what you think," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think," Frank replied, moving even closer. "Question is, are you boys planning to share?" The words hung in the air like ice crystals, and Margaret felt the last of her hope drain away. Whatever slim chance she'd had of rescue had just vanished with Frank's arrival. Now she was trapped on a mountain with 3 men, and the night was just beginning. The snow continued to fall, heavier now, covering their tracks and cutting them off from the world below. In the distance, she could still see the faint lights of Pine Valley, but they might as well have been on another planet. Margaret Winters closed her eyes and prayed for Emma, for her mother, for anyone who might miss her when she didn't come home. But as the wind howled through the pine trees and the snow swirled around them like a living thing, she began to understand that she might never see any of them again. The last thing she saw before Tommy grabbed her arm was the gun glinting in the light from Frank's truck, and she realized with crystal clarity that this was how it would end. Not with love or happiness or the peaceful old age she'd always imagined, but here on this frozen mountain with 3 men whose names would forever be linked with hers in the darkest possible way. The sound of her scream was swallowed by the wind before it could travel more than a few yards, lost in the vast wilderness that surrounded Devil's Ridge. And as the snow continued to fall, erasing all evidence of their presence, Margaret Winters began her descent into a nightmare that would haunt Pine Valley for decades to come. January 15th, 19... The wind had died to a whisper, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the soft patter of snowflakes against the frozen ground. Margaret's scream echoed for a brief moment before being swallowed by the vast emptiness of the mountain wilderness, as if the very landscape conspired to keep her secrets buried beneath layers of pristine white. Tommy Brennan's grip on her arm tightened as Frank Morrison circled them like a predator sizing up wounded prey. The older man's eyes gleamed with an unholy light in the reflection of the truck's headlights, and Margaret could smell the stench of cheap whiskey and unwashed clothes radiating from his massive frame. "Please," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't tell anyone. Just let me go home to my daughter." Frank's laughter was like gravel grinding against glass. "Oh, sweetheart, we're way past that now." He turned to Tommy, his voice dropping to a conspirative whisper. "How long you boys been planning this little adventure?" "It wasn't planned," Eddie Flores said quietly, though his words carried less conviction than his tone suggested. "We just ran into her in town." "Bullshit," Frank spat. pulling a flask from his coat pocket and taking a long swig. "I've seen you watching her, Tommy. Seen you driving past her house, following her to the grocery store. This ain't no chance encounter." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice water. The sensation of being watched, the white car in her peripheral vision, the feeling of eyes on her whenever she walked alone. It had all been real. They had been stalking her, studying her routines, waiting for the right moment. "How long?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know. Tommy's smile was cruel in the harsh light. "Since you moved back to town after your divorce. 2 years, Maggie. 2 years of watching you parade around like you owned the place, like you were too good for the rest of us. I never—" "Shut up," Tommy snapped, the gun appearing in his hand again. "You had your chance to be nice, to show a little appreciation for the attention. But you had to be a stuck-up bitch about it." Margaret's mind raced, searching for some way to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in these men. "Tommy, please. Think about what you're doing. You know me. You know I'm not what you think I am. I work at the library. I volunteer at the church. I'm just trying to raise my daughter and build a quiet life." "Quiet life," Frank repeated mockingly. "That's rich. You think you're better than us working folks, don't you? Think your fancy divorce settlement and your college education make you special." "That's not true," Margaret protested. But even as she said it, she realized how it must look to them. She had received a settlement from her ex-husband, a successful businessman from Denver, who had left her for his secretary. She did have a college degree, something relatively rare among the women in Pine Valley, and yes, she had tried to distance herself from the rougher elements of the small town. "Prove it," Eddie said suddenly, speaking for the first time in several minutes. His quiet voice was somehow more menacing than Frank's bluster or Tommy's obvious rage. "Show us you're not too good for us." "How?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. Eddie's smile was cold as the mountain air. "You know how." The next few minutes passed in a blur of horror that Margaret's mind would later struggle to piece together. Tommy forced her toward a fallen log near the edge of the clearing, while Frank positioned his truck so the headlights illuminated the area like a makeshift stage. Eddie stood watch, occasionally glancing toward the road as if expecting company, though they all knew no one else would be foolish enough to attempt the treacherous drive in this weather. What happened next in those snow-covered pines would haunt Pine Valley for decades, though the full truth would never be known. Margaret fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, her fingernails drawing blood as she clawed at Tommy's face. But she was no match for 3 men, and the gun was always there, always pointing at her heart whenever her resistance grew too strong. When it was over, she lay motionless in the snow, her auburn hair fanned out like spilled wine against the white ground. Her green eyes, once so full of life and secret dreams, stared sightlessly at the falling snow. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his earlier bravado evaporating as the reality of what they had done settled over them. "Jesus Christ. Tommy, what have we done?" Tommy stood over Margaret's still form, the gun hanging loose in his hand. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked like what he was, a 24-year-old man who had just crossed a line from which there was no return. "She wouldn't stop fighting," he said, his voice hollow. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Bullshit," Eddie said flatly. "You brought the gun. You planned this." "Not this," Tommy protested. "Not this." But Eddie was already moving, his practical mind shifting into damage control mode. "We need to get rid of her," he said matter-of-factly, "and we need to get our story straight." Frank backed away from the body, shaking his head. "I can't be part of this. I got grandkids, man. I can't." "You're already part of it," Eddie cut him off. "You were here, you saw what happened. That makes you an accessory." "I didn't touch her." "Try explaining that to Sheriff Kowalski," Eddie replied. "Think he's going to believe the town drunk over 2 upstanding young men?" The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Danny Kowalski, the man who had stood Margaret up that evening, was the son of Pine Valley's longtime sheriff. If Margaret had simply gone home after being stood up, She would have been safe in her bed by now, reading a book or calling her daughter good night. "What do we do?" Tommy asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eddie looked around the clearing, his mind working through the possibilities. The cliff was 50 yards away, marked by warning signs that were already invisible in the swirling snow. Beyond those signs was a sheer drop of nearly 2,000 feet into a rocky canyon that few people ever visited. "We weight her down and throw her over the edge," Eddie said simply. "By the time the snow melts in spring, there won't be anything left for anyone to find." Frank made a strangled sound of protest. "We can't just—" "We can and we will," Eddie interrupted. "Unless you've got a better idea." They worked in grim silence, using rocks from the mountainside to weigh down Margaret's body. The snow continued to fall, covering their tracks as fast as they made them. Within an hour, it would be as if they had never been there at all. As they carried their burden toward the cliff, Tommy stumbled, his nerve finally breaking. "I can't do this," he sobbed. "I can't throw her over like a piece of garbage." "Then you should have thought of that before you pulled the trigger," Eddie said coldly. "It was an accident. Tell that to her daughter." The mention of Emma seemed to break something in Tommy. He began to weep openly, great heaving sobs that echoed across the mountain wilderness. She was so beautiful. I just wanted her to notice me." "Well, she noticed you," Eddie said. "Now help me get her to the edge before this snow gets any worse." They reached the warning signs as the storm intensified, the wind beginning to howl again through the pine trees. Below them, invisible in the darkness, lay the canyon that would become Margaret's unmarked grave. But as they prepared to complete their terrible task, Eddie suddenly held up a hand for silence. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, came the sound of another engine laboring up the mountain road. "Shit," Frank whispered. "Who the hell else would be crazy enough to come up here tonight?" They waited, frozen like statues, as the sound grew closer. Within minutes, the headlights of a second vehicle became visible through the snow. A sheriff's department jeep, its four-wheel drive allowing it to navigate the treacherous road that would have stopped most other vehicles. "It's Kowalski," Eddie said, recognizing the distinctive outline of the official vehicle. "Someone must have reported us missing." "Or her," Tommy added, his voice thick with despair. Sheriff Robert Kowalski was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, a man who had seen enough of human nature to recognize trouble when he found it. At 55, he possessed the kind of weathered competence that came from decades of dealing with the worst that small-town life had to offer. He was also Danny's father, and he knew his son had been supposed to meet Margaret Winters that evening. The jeep stopped 30 yards from Tommy's Camaro, and Sheriff Kowalski climbed out slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his service weapon. He wore a heavy winter coat and carried a powerful flashlight that cut through the falling snow like a sword. "Evening, boys," he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mighty dangerous night for a drive up the mountain." "Evening, Sheriff," Tommy replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just showing a friend the view." Kowalski's flashlight beam swept the clearing, taking in the two vehicles, the three men, and the disturbed snow around the fallen log. "Friend? I don't see anyone else here." She went back to town with someone else," Eddie improvised. "Another car came by earlier." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. He had been doing this job long enough to recognize a lie when he heard one, and everything about this situation screamed wrong. Three men, alone on a mountain in a blizzard, with no woman in sight, despite their claims. "Who was the woman?" Kowalski asked, moving closer. "Margaret Winters," Frank blurted out before the other two could stop him. "We gave her a ride up here to see the view." Kowalski's expression darkened. He knew Margaret, had known her family for years. She was not the type of woman to go joyriding with troublemakers like Tommy Brennan and Eddie Flores, especially not on a night like this. "My son Danny was supposed to meet Margaret for dinner tonight," the sheriff said slowly. "He's been looking for her, Says she never came home. The three men exchanged glances, their makeshift alibi crumbling before their eyes. Behind them, hidden in the snow near the cliff edge, Margaret's body lay waiting to be discovered. Maybe she went somewhere else after we dropped her off, Tommy suggested weakly. Where? Kowalski demanded. Where exactly did you drop her off? Another exchange of glances. They hadn't thought this through, hadn't prepared for interrogation. At the diner, Eddie said. Murphy's diner. Betty Murphy called me an hour ago, Kowalski replied flatly. Said Margaret left there around 8 o'clock and she looked upset. Betty saw her get into a white car with two men. The net was closing around them, and they all knew it. Sheriff Kowalski was no fool, and their story was full of holes big enough to drive a truck through. I think you boys better come with me, Kowalski said, his hand now openly resting on his weapon. We need to have a longer conversation about this evening's activities. We haven't done anything wrong, Tommy protested, but his voice cracked with fear. Then you won't mind answering some questions downtown, the sheriff replied. All three of you. That's when Eddie made his fatal mistake. Perhaps it was panic, perhaps it was the knowledge that they were already caught, or perhaps it was simple desperation. Whatever the reason, he suddenly bolted toward the sheriff, hoping to overpower him and escape into the wilderness. Kowalski was ready for him. The veteran lawman stepped aside smoothly and brought his flashlight down hard on Eddie's skull, dropping him instantly to the snow. The sound of the impact echoed across the clearing like a gunshot. Tommy and Frank stood frozen, watching Eddie writhe in the snow, clutching his bleeding head. The sight seemed to break whatever resolve they had left. I'll tell you everything, Frank babbled, falling to his knees in the snow. God help me. I'll tell you everything. Just don't let them put this on me. I got grandkids, Sheriff. I got grandkids. Sheriff Kowalski looked at the three men, one unconscious, one sobbing, one still standing in shocked silence, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Whatever had happened to Margaret Winters, these three knew about it, and judging by their behavior, it was nothing good. Start talking, he said to Frank. And it better be the truth. January 16th. The search for Margaret's body began at first light, though the continuing snowfall made the task nearly impossible. Sheriff Kowalski had radioed for backup as soon as Frank Morrison broke down and confessed everything, but it would be hours before additional deputies could navigate the treacherous mountain roads. Tommy Brennan sat in the back of the sheriff's jeep, handcuffed and staring out at the snow-covered landscape where he had destroyed so many lives in a single night. Eddie Flores had been taken to the hospital with a severe concussion, though he would recover to face charges. Frank Morrison had been released after giving his full statement, his cooperation and obvious remorse earning him a measure of mercy from the sheriff. As the sun rose over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing, a team of searchers rappelled down the cliff face, looking for any sign of Margaret's body. The canyon below was a maze of rocks and fallen trees, covered now by several feet of fresh snow. It would be 11 months before they found her. Pine Valley Public Library, January 16th. Dorothy Chen, the head librarian and Margaret's supervisor, stood in the empty building, wondering where her assistant could be. Margaret was never late, never missed work without calling. It was completely unlike her to simply not show up. The phone rang, and Dorothy answered it with growing anxiety. Pine Valley Library, Dorothy speaking. Dorothy, this is Sheriff Kowalski. I need to ask you about Margaret Winters. The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. What about her? Is she all right? I'm afraid not, the sheriff said gently. She's been reported missing, and we have reason to believe she may have come to harm. Dorothy sank into Margaret's chair, surrounded by the books she had been cataloging just the day before. What happened? We're still investigating, Kowalski replied. But I need you to think back over the past few weeks. Did Margaret mention anything unusual? Anyone bothering her? Did she seem afraid of anyone? Dorothy closed her eyes, trying to remember. She mentioned feeling like she was being watched. she said slowly. Last week, I think it was. She said she kept seeing a white car whenever she walked to work. Did she report it to anyone? I don't think so. She said it was probably just her imagination. After hanging up, Dorothy sat alone in the library, surrounded by thousands of books but unable to find words for the grief that was already beginning to overwhelm her. Margaret had been more than just a co-worker. She had been a friend, a kindred spirit in a town that didn't always appreciate educated women. The morning newspapers would carry the story on the front page. Local woman missing after night out. The headline was innocuous enough, but Dorothy knew that in a town like Pine Valley, Margaret's reputation would be destroyed even before her body was found. People would whisper about what a respectable woman was doing out with men like Tommy Brennan and Eddie Flores. They would speculate about her character, her morals, her fitness as a mother. The victim, as always, would be blamed for her own victimization. Pine Valley Elementary School. Emma Winters sat in her third-grade classroom, watching the clock and waiting for her mother to pick her up. At 8 years old, she had already learned that adults didn't always keep their promises. But her mother was different. Her mother always came when she said she would. When the final bell rang and the other children filed out to meet their parents, Emma remained in her seat, certain that her mother would appear at any moment with an apologetic smile and a story about traffic or an unexpected customer at the library. But as the minutes ticked by and the classroom emptied, Emma felt the first cold fingers of fear beginning to squeeze her heart. Something was wrong. Her mother would never leave her waiting like this. Mrs. Patterson, her teacher, approached with the careful expression adults wore when they were about to deliver bad news. Emma, sweetheart, your grandmother is here to pick you up. Where's my mommy? Emma asked, though some part of her already knew she wouldn't like the answer. Your grandmother will explain everything, Mrs. Patterson said gently. Why don't you gather your things? Emma's grandmother, Ruth Winters, waited in the hallway with red-rimmed eyes and a forced smile that didn't reach her face. She was a sturdy woman in her 60s who had raised 4 children of her own and thought she was done with the chaos of young lives. Now, suddenly, she was facing the prospect of raising her granddaughter alone. Where's Mommy? Emma asked again as her grandmother helped her with her coat. Mommy's away right now, Ruth said carefully. She's going to be away for a while. How long? Ruth Winters closed her eyes, trying to find words that would make sense to an 8-year-old child. How do you explain to a little girl that her mother is never coming home? How do you tell her that the person she loves most in the world is lying at the bottom of a canyon, broken and alone? I don't know, sweetheart, Ruth said finally. I just don't know. Pine Valley Sheriff's Department. Tommy Brennan sat in the interrogation room, his hands shaking as he tried to light his 5th cigarette of the hour. Across from him, Sheriff Kowalski waited patiently, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. I want to call a lawyer, Tommy said for the 3rd time. You're entitled to one, Kowalski replied. But lawyers cost money, and I hear you don't have much of that. Besides, cooperation might go a long way toward reducing your sentence. What sentence? I haven't been convicted of anything. Yet, Kowalski said simply. But we've got Frank Morrison's statement, and we've got physical evidence from the scene. It's just a matter of time before we find her body. Tommy's face crumpled. It was an accident, he whispered. I swear to God, Sheriff, I never meant for her to die. Tell me what happened, Kowalski said, leaning forward. From the beginning. And so Tommy Brennan, killer and stalker, began to tell the story that would dominate headlines across Colorado for months to come. He told of watching Margaret from afar, of building elaborate fantasies about winning her love, of convincing himself that she was just playing hard to get. He told of the plan that wasn't really a plan, the decision to drive her up to Devil's Ridge to talk to her. He told of the gun he brought for protection and the flask of whiskey that gave him courage he didn't deserve. But when he reached the part about what actually happened in those snow-covered pines, his story became fragmented, contradictory. He claimed it was an accident, that the gun went off during a struggle. He claimed he was trying to calm Margaret down, not hurt her. He claimed he loved her. Sheriff Kowalski listened to it all with the weary expression of a man who had heard too many confessions from too many criminals who couldn't understand that love and obsession were not the same thing. "Where's the gun now, Tommy?" he asked when the story finally wound down. "I threw it in the canyon," Tommy admitted. After we threw her over." "And you're sure she was dead?" Tommy nodded miserably. Eddie checked. There was so much blood, Sheriff. So much blood." The confession was recorded, signed, and filed away as evidence. Within hours it would be leaked to reporters, and by morning, every detail of Margaret Winter's final night would be front-page news across the region. But as Sheriff Kowalski walked home through the snow-covered streets of Pine Valley, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing from Tommy's story. There were inconsistencies, gaps that didn't quite make sense, and until they found Margaret's body and could piece together the physical evidence, those gaps would continue to haunt the investigation. The storm that had covered the mountains on the night of Margaret's death continued for 3 more days, dumping over 4 feet of snow across the region and making any search for her remains impossible. By the time the weather cleared, the crime scene had been transformed into a pristine white landscape that revealed nothing of the horror that had taken place there. Margaret Winters had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all, leaving behind only a grieving daughter, a devastated mother, and a community that would never quite feel safe again. But in the depths of the canyon below Devil's Ridge, beneath layers of snow and stone, Margaret's body waited patiently to tell its own version of that terrible night, a version that would prove to be far more complex and disturbing than anyone in Pine Valley could possibly imagine. December 10th, 1973. Devil's Ridge Canyon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon floor, illuminating patches of exposed rock where the early winter winds had blown away the lighter snow. 11 months had passed since Margaret Winters vanished into the mountain wilderness. 11 months of fruitless searches and false leads that had slowly drained the hope from everyone who knew her. Dr. James Hartley, the state's forensic anthropologist, picked his way carefully through the rocky terrain, his trained eyes scanning for anything that didn't belong to the natural landscape. At 62, he had spent the better part of 4 decades recovering the remains of the lost and forgotten, and he possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot human bones among the detritus of the wilderness. "Over here," called Deputy Martinez, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I think I found something." Hartley made his way to where the young deputy stood, pointing at what appeared to be a piece of faded blue fabric, caught on a twisted pine branch about 30 feet from the canyon floor. Even from this distance, Hartley could see that the fabric was man-made, incongruous among the natural browns and grays of the rocky landscape. "Don't touch anything," Hartley instructed, pulling his camera from his pack. "Let's document everything exactly as we find it." The search team had been combing the canyon for 3 days, following up on a tip from a rock climber who claimed to have spotted something unusual while scaling the cliff face the previous weekend. Sheriff Kowalski had been skeptical. They had searched this area multiple times over the past year, but the climber's description of what looked like human remains had been too specific to ignore. As they worked their way deeper into the canyon, following the path that gravity and time would have carved for any object thrown from Devil's Ridge, the searchers began to find more evidence. A woman's shoe, its brown leather cracked but still recognizable. Fragments of bone that could have belonged to an animal, but which Hartley's experienced eye immediately identified as human. And then, wedged between 2 massive boulders, in a position that suggested the body had come to rest there after rolling down the steep slope, they found Margaret Winters. What remained of her was not much. 11 months of exposure to the elements, the attention of scavengers, and the crushing weight of falling rocks had reduced a vibrant woman to scattered bones and scraps of clothing. But to Dr. Hartley's trained eye, those remains told a story that was far more complex and disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Sheriff Kowalski needs to see this immediately, Hartley said quietly, his voice tight with professional concern. Pine Valley Sheriff's Department. December. The autopsy report lay open on Sheriff Kowalski's desk, like an accusation. Dr. Hartley sat across from him, his weathered face grave as he explained what the bones had revealed about Margaret Winter's final hours. The skull fracture is consistent with a gunshot wound, Hartley said, pointing to a photograph of Margaret's reconstructed skull. Small caliber, probably a .22 or .22 or .25, fired at close range. That matches Tommy Brennan's confession. But, Kowalski prompted, sensing there was more. But the trajectory is all wrong, Hartley continued. According to Brennan's statement, the gun went off during a struggle, while Margaret was standing. The bullet hole in the skull shows the shot was fired from above and behind, with the victim in a prone position. Kowalski felt a cold certainty settling in his stomach. Execution style. That's what it looks like to me, Hartley confirmed. And there's something else. The hyoid bone in her throat is fractured. Strangulation. Manual strangulation. Almost certainly. The pattern of the break suggests someone with large, strong hands squeezed her throat with considerable force. Hartley paused, consulting his notes. There are also multiple fractures to the ribs that show signs of healing. Healing? Kowalski leaned forward. You mean old injuries? Some of them, yes. But several are fresh, consistent with the time of death. Someone beat her severely, Sheriff. This wasn't a crime of passion or an accident. This was prolonged, systematic torture. The implications hit Kowalski like a physical blow. Tommy Brennan's confession had painted a picture of a sexual assault that went wrong. A young man overcome by desire and rejection, who had acted in a moment of rage. The physical evidence suggested something far more sinister, a deliberate, prolonged murder that involved multiple forms of torture. There's one more thing, Hartley said quietly. I found fibers under her fingernails, blue denim, consistent with work clothes. But I also found something else. Skin cells that don't match any of the three suspects. A fourth person. It's possible. The DNA testing is still preliminary, but it appears Margaret fought with at least 4 different people that night. Kowalski stared at the photographs scattered across his desk, each one revealing new horrors about Margaret's final hours. The woman had fought like a lioness, clawing and scratching at her attackers, even as they systematically destroyed her. The courage it must have taken, the sheer will to survive even in the face of certain death, was both inspiring and heartbreaking. I need to talk to Tommy Brennan again, Kowalski said finally. Colorado State Penitentiary. December 5th. Tommy Brennan had aged a decade in the 11 months since his arrest. The baby-faced young man who had stalked Margaret Winters through the streets of Pine Valley had been replaced by a hollow-eyed convict whose hands shook constantly from withdrawal and fear. Prison had not been kind to him, and the other inmates had made their opinion of child killers and rapists abundantly clear. I told you everything, Tommy said when Sheriff Kowalski sat down across from him in the visitor's room. I don't know what else you want from me. I want the truth, Kowalski replied, sliding the autopsy photographs across the table. Because what you told me doesn't match what we found. Tommy glanced at the photographs and immediately looked away, his face turning green. Jesus Christ, Sheriff, why are you showing me those? Because they tell a different story than the one you told me, Kowalski said relentlessly. They tell the story of a woman who was tortured for hours before she was murdered. They tell the story of multiple attackers, systematic brutality, and a cold-blooded execution. It wasn't like that, Tommy whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Then tell me how it was, Tommy. Tell me the real story this time. For a long moment, Tommy stared at his hands, and Kowalski could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Finally, the young man looked up, and there was something broken in his expression that hadn't been there before. There were others, he said quietly. More than just Eddie and Frank. Who? Tommy's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Some guys from out of town. Eddie knew them from his time in Denver. Real hard cases, you know? The kind of guys who did things for money. Kowalski felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. What kind of things, Tommy? Bad things. Eddie said they had experience with situations like this. Women who needed to be taught a lesson. The sheriff's blood ran cold. You're telling me this was planned? That you hired professional killers? Not killers, Tommy protested. Eddie said they were just going to scare her. Make her understand what happens to stuck-up bitches who think they're too good for regular people. But it went further than that. Tommy nodded miserably. Way further. Once they got started, they couldn't stop. It was like they enjoyed it, you know. The fear in her eyes, the way she begged. He shuddered. I tried to stop them, Sheriff. I swear to God I tried to make them stop. What were their names, Tommy? I don't know. Eddie handled all that. He just called them his friends from Denver. But they were animals, Sheriff. Pure animals. Kowalski made detailed notes as Tommy finally told the complete story of that night on Devil's Ridge. It was a tale of escalating horror that began with stalking and intimidation and ended with the systematic torture and murder of an innocent woman whose only crime had been rejecting the wrong man's advances. The hired killers had come prepared with tools and techniques that spoke of considerable experience in inflicting pain. They had taken turns with Margaret, each one trying to outdo the others in terms of cruelty and degradation. When she finally broke, when her spirit was completely shattered, they had forced her to her knees and executed her with Tommy's gun. Eddie said it had to be my gun, Tommy explained, tears streaming down his face. Said that way, if anyone found the body, the evidence would point to me instead of his friends. And you went along with this? I was scared, Sheriff. These guys, you should have seen them. They would have killed me too if I had tried to stop them. After the murder, the professional killers had vanished back to Denver, leaving Tommy, Eddie, and Frank to dispose of the body and clean up the scene. They had been paid handsomely for their work, money that Eddie had used to leave Pine Valley immediately after his release from the hospital. Where's Eddie now, Tommy? Gone. Left town the day after they released him. Said he was going to California, but I think he lied. Eddie always lied. Denver Police Department. The photograph that arrived via teletype from the Pine Valley Sheriff's Department showed a young man with dark hair and careful eyes. Eddie Flores, wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Margaret Winters. Detective Ray Castellanos studied the image for a long moment before walking to the filing cabinet, where they kept the unsolved cases. Eddie Flores was known to the Denver police. His real name was Eduardo Vasquez, and he had been a person of interest in 3 similar cases over the past 2 years, all involving young women who had been tortured and murdered in isolated locations around the Denver metropolitan area. The cases had gone cold due to lack of evidence, but the similarities were striking. Son of a bitch, Castellanos muttered, pulling out the files. We've been looking for this bastard for 2 years. The Denver cases followed an identical pattern. Attractive young women in their 20s, usually divorced or single mothers, who were approached by charming young men and lured to isolated locations where they were murdered by unknown assailants. In each case, the women had been tortured extensively before being killed, and in each case, the body had been dumped in a location where it might never be found. Castellanos reached for his phone to call Sheriff Kowalski. It appeared that Margaret Winters had been the victim of a serial killer who had been operating across the Colorado Front Range for years. Pine Valley Elementary School, May 5th. Emma Winters, now 9 years old, sat in the school counselor's office trying to make sense of the words the adults were using to describe what had happened to her mother. Words like murder and torture and justice that seemed too big and terrible to apply to the woman who used to read her bedtime stories and make pancakes shaped like animals. The men who hurt your mommy are going to prison, the counselor said gently. They can never hurt anyone else again. Emma nodded, though she didn't really understand what prison meant. All she knew was that her mother was never coming home, and that the nice life they had built together in their little house on Elm Street was gone forever. Her grandmother had been kind, but Ruth Winters was 70 years old and struggling to raise an active young girl. Emma had learned to be quiet, to make herself small, to not cause trouble. She had learned that asking about her mother made adults cry, so she stopped asking. But late at night, when the house was dark and quiet, Emma would lie in her bed and whisper stories to her mother's ghost. She would tell her about school and her friends and the books she was reading. She would promise to be good, to make her mother proud, to grow up strong and brave. Sometimes, if she listened very carefully, she could almost hear her mother's voice whispering back, "I love you, baby girl. Be happy. Be safe. Live a beautiful life for both of us." Colorado State Court, September. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious onlookers as Judge Harrison delivered his verdict in the case of People v. Thomas Brennan. Tommy sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his court-appointed attorney, looking like a broken man who had aged 20 years in the past 18 months. Having heard all the evidence presented in this case, Judge Harrison intoned, "This court finds the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, aggravated sexual assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. The sentence of this court is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. It was one of the harshest sentences ever handed down in Pine Valley County, but given the horrific nature of the crime, few people felt it was too severe. Tommy showed no reaction to the verdict. He had been expecting it, had perhaps even been hoping for it. Prison was dangerous for men who hurt women and children, but it was still preferable to the alternative that had been consuming his thoughts for months. Eddie Flores, Eduardo Vasquez, would never face trial. His body had been found in a Denver alley 3 weeks earlier, the victim of what police described as a professional hit. Someone had put 2 bullets in the back of his head and left him to rot behind a warehouse. The Denver police suspected that Eddie's former associates had decided he had become too much of a liability, but the case would never be solved. Frank Morrison had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, but the guilt of his complicity had destroyed him. He had started drinking heavily immediately after the trial, and by Christmas of 1974 he would be found dead in his trailer, a victim of cirrhosis and despair. Pine Valley Cemetery, January 5th. 2 years to the day after Margaret Winters had vanished into the mountain wilderness, her daughter Emma stood at her mother's graveside holding a bouquet of winter roses. At 10 years old, she was tall for her age, with her mother's auburn hair and green eyes, though those eyes held a gravity that no child should possess. The headstone was simple black granite with Margaret's name, dates, and a brief inscription. "Beloved mother and daughter, she lives on in love." It told nothing of the vibrant woman who had been stolen from the world, nothing of her dreams or her kindness or the way she had fought like a lioness to survive. "I'm going to be okay, Mummy," Emma whispered, placing the roses at the base of the stone. "Grandma Ruth is teaching me to be strong. She says you were the strongest person she ever knew." A cold wind blew down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow. Emma pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and looked up at Devil's Ridge, visible in the distance through the bare branches of the cemetery trees. "I'm going to make you proud," she continued. "I'm going to live a good life, and I'm going to help other people who are hurt and scared. I promise." The wind seemed to whisper through the trees, and for just a moment Emma could have sworn she heard her mother's voice carried on the mountain air. "I love you, baby girl. I'll always love you." Pine Valley, Colorado, January 5th. 50 years after her mother's murder, Dr. Emma Winters McKay stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Colorado, delivering a lecture on victims' rights and the psychological impact of violent crime on families. At 58, she bore a striking resemblance to the mother she had lost so many years ago, though her hair was now streaked with silver and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had transformed tragedy into purpose. "My mother was murdered when I was 8 years old," she told the audience of law students and social workers. For many years I was defined by that loss. I was the girl whose mother was killed, the victim's daughter, the object of pity and whispered conversations. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces hanging on her every word. But I learned something important as I grew older. We are not defined by the worst things that happen to us. We are defined by how we choose to respond to those things. My mother's death was a tragedy that changed the course of my life forever, but it also gave me a purpose: to help other victims and their families find justice, healing, and hope. Dr. Winters Mackay had indeed lived up to her childhood promise. She had become one of the nation's leading experts on trauma counseling, had helped pass landmark legislation protecting crime victims' rights, and had founded a non-profit organization that provided support services to families of murder victims. She had also raised 3 children of her own, and had made sure they knew the story of the grandmother they had never met, not the horrible details of her death, but the beautiful details of her life. Margaret Winters lived on in her daughter's work, her grandchildren's laughter, and in the countless lives that had been touched by the foundation established in her memory. After her lecture, Dr. Winters Mackay drove the familiar mountain roads to Pine Valley, a journey she made every year on the anniversary of her mother's death. The town had changed over the decades. It was larger now, more prosperous, with ski resorts and vacation homes replacing some of the old mining and logging operations, but the cemetery remained much the same, and Margaret's grave was still there, well tended and decorated with fresh flowers that Emma knew had been placed there by other members of the community who still remembered. She knelt beside the headstone and placed her own bouquet, winter roses, just as she had as a child, at its base. "I kept my promise, Mom," she said quietly. "I lived a good life. I helped people. I made a difference." The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the voices of the past and the promise of the future. Somewhere in that wind, Emma could still hear her mother's voice, as clear and loving as it had been 50 years ago. "I'm so proud of you, baby girl. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." As the sun set behind Devil's Ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, Emma Winters Mackay stood and walked back to her car. Tomorrow she would return to her work, to the endless task of helping others heal from unimaginable loss. But tonight she carried with her the certain knowledge that love transcends death, that justice can emerge from tragedy, and that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope endures. The case of Margaret Rose Winters was officially closed, but its impact would resonate through generations. In courtrooms and counseling centers, in legislation and law enforcement training, in the quiet conversations between mothers and daughters about safety and strength. Margaret's story continued to matter. Tommy Brennan died in prison in 1987, killed by another inmate in what the guards described as a settling of accounts. He had served 13 years of his life sentence, and his death was noted in a brief paragraph on page 6 of the Pine Valley Gazette. Few people mourned his passing, but Margaret Winters was remembered. She was remembered in the scholarship fund that sent disadvantaged young women to college. She was remembered in the crisis center that bore her name. She was remembered in the lives of her grandchildren, who grew up knowing that they were descended from a woman of courage and strength. Most of all, she was remembered by her daughter, who had taken the worst tragedy imaginable and transformed it into a force for good in the world. Margaret Rose Winters had died at 28, her life cut short by violence and hatred, but through Emma, through her work, through the countless lives that had been touched by her story, Margaret lived on. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest victory of all. Not just that justice had been served, but that love had triumphed over hate, that hope had emerged from despair, and that one woman's courage in her final moments had inspired generations of others to fight for a better world. The snow began to fall as Emma drove down from the mountains, soft flakes that caught the light from her headlights like tiny stars. In her rearview mirror, Devil's Ridge disappeared into the darkness, taking with it the ghosts of that terrible night 50 years ago. But Margaret's love traveled with her daughter into the valley below, where the lights of Pine Valley twinkled like promises in the darkness, and where tomorrow would bring new opportunities to heal, to help, and to honor the memory of a woman who had never been forgotten.